Good afternoon, and welcome to the Distinguished Speakers in International Business Series. Please note that this event is being recorded. My name is Marina Augustidis. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Global Business. The Center is the hub and driver of global education and activity at the Smith School. The mission of the Center is to connect the diverse members of the Smith School community to the world and the world to the Smith School, to provide these members and partners with opportunities to gain a global mindset and build international business skills, and to serve as a Maryland resource center for companies seeking to take their goods into the global marketplace. The center is also one of 15 nationally recognized centers across the country to have been awarded a Title VI grant known as CIBE or CYBER. The CIBE grant is administered by the U.S. Department of Education and supports many of our activities, including this event today, and expands our mission outside the campus to industry and other academic institutions. The Distinguished Speakers in International Business Series brings together policymakers, industry leaders, academia, and students to discuss emerging trends in international business throughout the year. The event this afternoon is an annual part of the Distinguished Speakers in International Business Series, celebrating Women's History Month at Maryland Smith. And I'm honored to give a special welcome to our speakers this afternoon and to the Center's Executive Director, Rebecca Bellinger, who will take us into a discussion after I finish a few more opening comments. Before I introduce our speakers, please let me share a few tips to help us move smoothly through the next hour. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. It will be made publicly available via the school's website and emailed out to all participants afterwards for future viewing. Following the discussion, we will open up the conversation for questions from the audience. Throughout the discussion, please feel free to send your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the order they are received at the end of the discussion. Additionally, if you are an undergraduate student seeking credit for iSmith, a QR code will appear on a slide at the end of the event. Please be sure to scan this to receive your credit. Once the event closes, you'll see a link to take our 2-minute survey about the event. We appreciate your taking the time to complete that, as your feedback is critical to the development of future virtual events. And if there are any technical difficulties on our end or yours, we thank you in advance for your patience. We'd also like to invite you to our upcoming annual forum on Tuesday, April 13th from 5 to 6 p.m., at which Academic Director Kisleya Prasad will discuss Mauro Gillian's latest book, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. Registration is now available on our website. Please also continue to engage with us on Twitter at Smith Global Biz for information on the annual forum and all other upcoming events. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers this afternoon. And for the full bios of our panelists, please go to the Center's website. Dr. Margot Thomas is the founder and president of Women's Economic Imperative and a 1991 alumna of Maryland Smith. Ms. Simona Scarpaleggia is global CEO of Edge Strategy and former CEO of IKEA Switzerland. Dr. Linda Scott is the author of The Double X Economy, The Epic Potential of Women's Empowerment, and Emeritus DP World Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Oxford. Ms. Elizabeth Vasquez is the president, CEO, and co-founder of We Connect International and co-author of Buying for Impact, How to Buy from Women and Change Our World. And last, but certainly not least, our moderator and executive director of the Center for Global Business, Rebecca Bellinger. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests.
Thank you, Marina, for that lovely welcome. And this, I think, panelists, is where we would hear the applause from the audience. We can imagine that's what we're hearing. I would like to add my own welcome to our audience members and especially to our esteemed panelists this afternoon. I am incredibly grateful and humbled, really, to be able to spend the next hour sharing this virtual stage that we have here with these 4 incredibly talented and inspiring women. Our conversation today, as Marina mentioned, will focus on women in the global economy and specifically closing the gender gap. And I'll spend just an additional minute here explaining what we mean by that. I'll point first to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The UN has articulated a goal that the world reach gender equality by 2030. And I'll just point out that that's 9 years away. So 9 years from now, how close are we to achieving this? Well, today, women make up about 50% of the world's population and make or influence 85% of the purchasing decisions worldwide. But less than half of women participate in the paid workforce compared to 74% of men. We earn 12% less than men for equivalent jobs. Only 1/3 of the world's private businesses are owned by women, and 18% of CEOs worldwide are women. Further, McKinsey reported that in the US, so a domestic example only, 1 in 4 women have considered leaving their jobs during this global pandemic. So since the start of this recession, women have lost 5.4 million jobs in the US, which is 1 million more than men. And I think it's really worth noting here that women of color have been the hardest hit by these losses. So what is going on here? We're going to take this conversation forward in 3 parts. First, we're going to look at the underlying causes of these disparities globally. And then I will ask our esteemed panelists to tell us more about themselves, tell us more about the organizations they work with, that they have founded, the research that they're doing, what they're doing to bring about change, and what other people around the world organizationally or in government perhaps, what we can do to bring change. And finally, most importantly, I think, we're going to try to answer the question of why and how this matters, and not just to women. So let's jump right in. If we can, Margot, I would love to start with you. You are an alumna of the school, so welcome back. I think next time we see each other, I will be able to welcome you to Van Munching Hall, but I'll welcome you to our virtual panel for now. You have an incredible background. You've been involved in a number of global and regional initiatives working towards women's economic empowerment. You've worked with the UN, and now you've started Women's Economic Imperative. So very broadly, from a high-level perspective, what can you tell us about the economic disparities that you've seen between men and women, and why do they exist?
Rebecca, thank you very much for this question. And I would like to say that as a starting point, I spent most of my career working on inclusive economic growth with private sector investment as a driver for that growth. I'm not by any means a gender expert, but the arc of my career led me to look at the issue of women's economic role and their economic contributions. So I would say that we have arrived at this point as a result of a confluence of structural, cultural, and political actions or history coming together to influence the continual limitations of women's economic activity. But most importantly, this ends up affecting everyone as a result. We lose when women are not given the room, the space, and the support to engage economically and fully. And this is where, in my work today, having left the World Bank and having spent a year leading the high-level panel secretariat for women's economic empowerment, I have now engaged through Women's Economic Imperative in addressing the issues that affect women's activity in the economic space. You'll hear from our fellow panel members more on developing the arguments and providing insights on where we are, but I think this is a good starting point.
Great. Margot, thank you for that perspective. Linda, I'd like to turn it over to you. You have spent much of your career doing research in this specific area, and your latest book, The Double X Economy, came out just last year and has already been translated into 11 languages. So congratulations on that. And what that tells me is that there is great interest in this topic globally. So for those of us or those of those in the audience who have not yet read your book, and I highly recommend it to everyone, could you tell us more about the research that you did in Ghana and elsewhere around the world and what you uncovered?
Yeah, the kinds of research that I've done in the field, such as in Ghana and East Africa and South Asia, were trying to do two things. One was kind of in a downstream way to try to experiment with interventions that could be used to remove the economic roadblocks to women's economic participation and to determine what things would work and what things would not, and what kind of tweaks needed to be made to roll out globally some of these interventions. So I've been doing that for 15 years. But as I was working on this, I saw a lot of similarities, surprising number of similarities between what I was seeing in very remote areas and what I was seeing in the elite business school where I was teaching, okay, and the executive education students that I was teaching, and also the historical work that I had done on women in the West. And so and in addition, about that time, there were massive data sets coming out internationally that we had not had before that allowed you to compare gender data by country. And there was a very strong pattern in that as well. And so what the XX economy does is that it assembles sort of from the ground up with the stuff in Ghana and South Asia, but also then links to the history of women in the West and to what the experiences are among elite women and the international data sets to try to provide a total picture of the women's economy and what it is, how big it is, and what it does. I would just want to add here, just as a way to tell you how big the gorilla in the room is, that in the United States, if the women's economy decided to declare, if the women of the United States decided to declare their own nation, their economy would be big enough to join the G7. So this is really big. It's really big. And it's really a mystery why it has been ignored so long.
Wow. Wow. Further to some of the outcomes that I was reading about in your book, would you be willing to give us a little bit more insight into what you mean by the shadow economy?
Yeah. It's a shadow economy, and unfortunately that term has been used a lot previously to just describe women in labor. And in fact, the women's economy reaches into every aspect of the economy: finance, credit, market access. And so because it's a total 360-degree economy that sits alongside what we see as the visible and so-called legitimate economy, but it has been ignored from a measurement perspective. And a great deal of it still operates outside the money system. Okay, a great deal of it is just invisible. In addition, there's the just stereotypical beliefs, such as, for example, when I give that G7 example, people are usually floored. They think that women are only a trivial, and in fact, economists are usually floored because they are so used to not looking at it because they assume it's not important. So it's a shadow economy for all of those reasons, that it's not engaged in the money system, it has been excluded from economic participation, it's not measured, and there's just blinkers about looking at it.
I'd love to ask you more about why you think that exists. Why those blinders might exist?
Well, because historically women have been excluded from the money system and participation by fairly aggressive structural measures and factors, and that it goes back like more than, well, I think in the book I trace it back at least 4,000 years. That it's just an underlying assumption. But the other thing is, and this may be what you're getting at, is that probably the biggest block, in my view, the biggest block is that economics is the most male-dominated discipline on the planet, and they are so determined to keep women out of it by any means, whether that means women professors, and because economists, unlike many other disciplines in the academy, have direct responsibility to governments because they advise governments. It keeps the women's economy off the global agenda. So if you want to point to the bad guys, you can point there.
Linda, thank you for going there. That is one of my big takeaways. And you use different kinds of language and you pull out different examples throughout your book. And I appreciate you bringing that up to us now. Simona, if I can turn to you now, I think that you have a perspective that's something we haven't heard yet. You come from industry. And you, as Marina mentioned, you recently left your position at Switzerland, IKEA Switzerland, after 20 years. And you also serve on corporate boards. So you've got what I would call the insider's perspective on business. So can you tell us what you've seen and experienced in your career as a woman leader in business?
Yes, Rebecca, I am in fact in business since 40 years and I've been always working in the private sector. So I definitely can bring that perspective. And nevertheless, I saw some of the things that have been mentioned both by Margot and Linda when it comes to barriers that are the leading causes are coming from political, structural and cultural aspects indeed. What I have also seen in any case, it's progress. And I just want to, I'm not, I don't think that the situation is positive, of course, but I do think that there is a way we can do something, and I can bring some examples. And one of the highlights of my career in this domain was when we at IKEA Switzerland, we got EDGE certified at the highest level of gender equality, meaning that we reached data-based gender equality. And which are the main steps where you can get there, actually? I can summarize them in three areas. The first one is awareness and commitment. We have to know, I mean, you mentioned data. Linda is working with data every day. Margot has acted upon with data her entire career. People need to understand what are we losing if we don't involve women in the picture. And when leaders have this awareness and of the benefits that come from it, other than the ethical duty we have to, then they take the commitment. When we have taken the commitment, the second area is measure, because with measure, you know where you are, you know, you can set targets and you can follow up. So it's very fact-based and there's no better way than to measure. And the third thing is really taking actions. What we did in IKEA Switzerland was exactly this process. We took actions, we measured, and we progressed. And so we closed the pay gap. We introduced policies and practices that were making all the further behaviors sustainable over time. And we also, at the end, acknowledged and celebrated. So these are simple, doable steps, but you need to be aware and committed. You need to mean it, do it, and then measure it, and then celebrate and talk about it. If I can really spend one last word about my experience, is that at this point, we need to also challenge all those leaders who please themselves saying that, we believe that this is important, we will do it. They just talk about it without doing anything about it. I think it's about time to hold them accountable. It's not enough anymore to feel understood, because in fact we are not, if there's not a subsequent action.
I love the fire that I'm hearing right now about this call for action to do something about it. Before we get to Elizabeth, Simona, I hope I can follow up with one additional question. You mentioned this idea of pay inequalities or the pay gap. And I think maybe you alluded to perhaps HR policies that were also perhaps discriminatory against women in the workplace. Very broadly, what are some of the other issues that companies might be facing when they're taking up this conversation about creating gender parity in the workplace? Is it just about the pay gap?
Not at all. Not at all. Having equal pay, it's something that is totally right. And it's basically a matter of compliance. You have to pay people the same for an equivalent job. However, this is not equivalent to a gender equal workplace. You can have women and men paid the same for equivalent job at the very operational level of the organization, and then women, as it is the case oftentimes, disappear. They don't get leadership positions. You mentioned the figures. There's very little women get into the C-suite, let alone in boards. There's not a healthy and gender balanced pipeline of people in the organization. So the representation of women in the workplace is also very important to measure and to secure. And how do you secure it? Through policies that are addressing exactly these points, but very simple ones. You don't need to make things so complicated, but have a gender balanced shortlist of candidates for promotion or for hiring, for instance, is already a good step to start.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And I think we're going to come back to that point in just a minute. But Elizabeth, I want to draw you into the conversation because the work that you have been doing over the past decade or so is of personal interest to me and personally connected to the mission really of the center here, which is international trade. And I don't think that we hear a lot about gender inequality or inequality among the sexes when we're talking about international trade. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? Is there something that you have been seeing in the marketplace, in relationships or opportunities for women-owned businesses that led you to want to address this?
Thanks, Rebecca, for that question and for the great work that you do at the center. And thanks to the other panelists, my friends who are passionate, fearless leaders focused on equality, equal opportunity. I'm driven by this question of how do we have equality or equal opportunity in a global economy whose systems have been set up by one group and whose assets flow to that group. And so, how does power work? Why do assets flow in some directions and not in others when there is real value there? And I think we have some hard questions where we have to be honest about the world as we've created it, our societies and our systems, and redesign for something that's a lot more inclusive and a lot more sustainable, that's good for the environment, that's good for society. When we create equal opportunities for men and women and non-binary people, the world's just a better place for everyone, because then everyone gets to contribute to and co-create the solutions that we all need in our day-to-day lives. And so I've always been driven by why are systems set up the way they are? And when I was at the nonprofit prior to We Connect International, I had the opportunity to talk with women business owners all over the world, all different sectors, all different sizes, industries, and ask them the question, what is it you want most as a business owner? And inevitably, without exception, what entrepreneurs want most, what women who own businesses want most, is a chance to sell their stuff. They get up in the morning because they're passionate about something, whether it's out of necessity or because they just want everyone to, benefit from what they're offering, their product or their service. They want to get their stuff into the market. And there was almost nothing at the time that was connecting these women business owners to actual markets, to actual buyers. And that was such a frustration because we were all doing so much on access to finance, microfinance in particular, education, training, education as an entrepreneurial enabler. And we are collecting a lot of data, not enough, but at the end of the day, if we want to grow the economy and create jobs and have inclusive growth, we have to look at the connections to markets. And so I was very fortunate to be in a position to talk with market makers, the market, these very, very large corporations that wanted to buy more products and services from women-owned businesses, and they just simply didn't know where the women are. And so they asked me at the time to create We Connect International with them. So we could talk more about that, but that's that's why I do what I do.
That's fantastic. I love what you're saying about power in this dynamic and structures. So really from this first part of our conversation, what I'm taking away is that there's a great deal of multidimensionality that defines the challenges that women are facing in the global economy today. And it's systemic. It's inclusive of laws and customs and power, Elizabeth, that you were just talking about, and institutions and structures as well. And this leads me to think about the pandemic. So on top of everything we've just talked about, enter the pandemic that has exposed, I think, another challenge that women are facing, in that they, and I keep saying they, but I also identify as a woman, so I might switch to we at this point. We simultaneously sometimes are acting as caregivers to the elderly, to children, to other members of our households, while at the same time being part of the paid workforce, or the shadow economy, to go back to Linda's term here. And perhaps this lack of balance or something there has contributed to women being forced out of the workforce. Would anyone like to speak to more to how the pandemic has affected women?
If I could jump in to kick it off here, I'd like to say that what the pandemic has done is really exacerbated something that has been affecting women across the board for as long as women have been engaged in economic activity. And we have not mastered the art of addressing or adapting roles and responsibilities within society to create greater balance so that men and women can contribute more fully. As a result, what the pandemic has done, the point you've made, is it's forced a significant portion of the world's population into deeper poverty. The estimates at a year ago was that an additional close to 100 million people would be pushed below the poverty line. Now we know that at least 50% of those people are women, and you add girls. So the pandemic then has really helped to push these issues even and bring them even more into center stage, but women disproportionately bear the cost and the associated risks. Women account for 70% of the formal global health force. Within that context, they're essential workers. They're the ones who have been most exposed, often working in conditions that are inimical to their health and without the necessary equipment and protections. But it's no surprise that on average, they're the ones that are least well paid. The point here is that this is an issue that affects not just the global north, not just the advanced countries, and not just the South. This is truly across the board. Yet those women are providing care within family structures, within extended families. So again, the pandemic has really forced us to come to terms with this. In terms of employment, for the same reasons, women have been forced to exit paying employment or to compromise on their ability to earn a wage in order to fulfill those responsibilities and family care. And you mentioned at the beginning, women of color, again, are significantly impacted even more so. For example, in December of last year, 154,000 Black women were forced to exit the US labor force, largely because they were employed in sectors that are predominantly where women work, in the services sector, tourism. Those were directly impacted. They're also are invariably the ones who were forced forced to give up employment as a result. Another area in which I think women and girls have been adversely impacted and it's overlooked is in some respects the monetization of girls. When families are pushed into poverty, girls in particular are often forced to undertake roles that put them at greater risk. And as a result, they're being monetized in larger numbers. And we tend to think that this is something that's happening only in the South, and it's not the case. It's happening in the North as well. It's just manifested differently. Another area in which women are disproportionately impacted relates to the issue of gender-based violence. And we've seen the statistics where the numbers have escalated as a result of social, familial, and economic pressures. Again, they're bearing a disproportionate share of the risk. So it really cuts across all of these areas. Even in cases where women are entrepreneurs, we can see the manifestation of the same benefits, the same issues that affect them in this regard.
Margot, thank you for that. I think that you've done a great job, and especially pointing out that it's not just in the global North that the pandemic has affected women in the workforce. So if we can move forward a little bit into our conversation to what I'd like to call the solutions section, if I can. I'm optimistic. I'd like to think that in 9 years, we can push the agenda forward and reach that goal that the UN has set out in the SDG. So I'll ask each of you in turn to tell us something more about you, about your work, about the organizations that you have founded, you've co-founded, the projects that you're working on that are serving to push this agenda forward. And Simona, if you're okay, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you. Well, now I joined Edge Strategy. Edge is an organization that supports organizations, so not only the private sector, but also institutions to measure, accelerate, and certify gender equality and intersectional equality in the workplace. And for me, that has been really a good way to conclude my career, because finally my personal social engagement coincides with the company mission. So I am particularly connected to the company in this case. I can say, because I was a client also of this company with IKEA, I can see that there are benefits in really acting and including the gender equality and more equal workplace in many dimensions in the agenda of in the strategic agenda of the company, and not only in a declaration of intent. What I see as a good opportunity, maybe, I don't know, all the models unfortunately don't say that we get in 2030 to gender equality, but in order to be optimistic, what we can say is that maybe really now it's the time, despite the backlashes that Margot has described, that in the wake of the COVID. Now it's the time, first and foremost, because enough is enough, as I said before, but because there is a growing pressure from employees, from consumers, and from lawmakers in order to close this gap, because the situation is becoming socially and economically and even environmentally unsustainable. And another good sign is that the big money flows are going, starting to divert in the right direction. There are many pension funds, sovereign funds that are starting to say they will not invest or even withdraw the investment from companies that cannot prove that they're not engaged in creating a more equal and balanced workplace. So these are positive signal. There is a good ground where to build, and here we need to go. When we were working together with Margot, with the high-level panel and Elizabeth for women's economic empowerment, we have also, I don't think that should be just left in a drawer, because it was a very concrete, very concise, and very actionable document that we were required to produce by Antonio Guterres, the second document. It is about really putting in place actions that are very concrete, that are listed there as an example, and there are more others. But the important thing, and I insist on this topic, is to hold people accountable. We had leaders in the first place. We had over 250 commitments, concrete commitments, which I thought it was a fantastic result to obtain. Where are we there? We need to go back and see, you committed on this, what happened? Because this will push. But I feel that this momentum, it's now. So we shouldn't abandon the field. No?
And I see a lot of your colleagues shaking their heads right now in agreement. So that's fantastic. Elizabeth, can we turn to you now? Can you tell us something more about WeConnect and how specifically it's helping women? And if you have any success stories or metrics, that would be fantastic for our audience to hear too.
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca, because the whole trade flow is such an important conversation. And I so appreciate what Margot and Simona and Linda have already shared about the importance of data. So maybe focusing on one simple statistic that I am driven by when we take a look at how large organizations spend their money. And we've been tracking this for 12 years now. We find that women, to your point, while they make the majority of all the consumer purchasing decisions, they're half the population, they have a third of the private businesses, they are literally invisible as suppliers in global value chains. They win less than 1% of all the money that's spent on products and services by large organizations, corporations, governments, and unfortunately, even many multilaterals. And so there's a huge, huge market failure that WeConnect International was launched to address. As I noted earlier, we were created by the actual market, by the largest buyers in the world. They self-organized and they said, we need access to the best suppliers. And right now, women-owned businesses are not in our supply chains, and we need them to be more competitive, to anticipate the needs of our customers, and to give a return on to our shareholders, while also doing better in serving our communities and giving everyone an opportunity to compete for our business. And as a result, we now work with women-owned businesses that can register for free across 120 countries. And we can actually certify that they are women-owned businesses in almost half those countries, about 60% of the world's population, so that when you buy from these businesses, you know that women will receive that money and decide how to spend that money. And that's actually important. And this goes to a lot of what Linda has done over the years, is how women spend their money. It has a multiplier effect. They tend to spend most of it on their families and on their communities. And it gives them, as business owners, a chance to address some of the biggest challenges we have with COVID, which is what Margot mentioned, which is employment. We need small businesses to be that engine of job creation. We desperately need women to be successful when they start and grow businesses, because we all need jobs, in addition to all the amazing solutions women have to offer the world, but don't necessarily have the opportunity to deliver those solutions because they don't have the same asset base. And when you have an asset base lending environment, women, by definition of how the systems are set up, are less able to leverage those opportunities. And so by giving them opportunities to get in front of actual buyers and pitch their business and understand what is it these buyers are looking for, what standards, how do you register, all of those things, you sort of demystify what it means to participate in trade and in international business. And we find that women, when given an opportunity, are hugely successful. And we survey our members across all these countries to understand what are the specific impacts of things like COVID. And yes, the majority of them have been negatively impacted, and some of them have had to close their doors. But others have leveraged technology in a really sophisticated, powerful way in less than a year to be able to keep their doors open, keep people employed, and to feed their families and support their communities. And they're doing it with just such powerful resilience and role modeling what can be done when you have that grit and determination and ability to be flexible and to be compassionate and to foresee the needs of your people. It's really, to me, an encouraging bright light in what has otherwise been, a disaster for so many people and communities. But I think there's a lot to look for. And we do make those reports public, so they're free on our website for anyone that's interested.
That's great. And Elizabeth, it's not just a personal interest in international trade and how I spend most of my days is thinking about international trade, but I love that effectively you have heard from, major buyers, where are the women? And you have brought the women to the same place. And so you've created it, and I don't know if this is the right term that you would use, but you've created this marketplace. You have connected the people who want to buy with the people who have something to sell. And that I think is half the battle that I'm understanding from all of you today. So thank you for your work with that. Margot, back to you. Tell us about WAY. Tell us about what you're trying to achieve. What are the goals of this new organization you've started?
Okay. So Women's Economic Imperative was actually established in response to the call to action that Simona Scarpaleggia mentioned from the high-level panel. So we have at least one data point, Simona, in terms of commitments and actions. No, but seriously, we have committed to working to advance women's economic empowerment by focusing on women's entrepreneurship and advocating for change, particularly in spaces where the issues related to women's economic roles are often overlooked or completely discounted. And we're focusing on the high-level panel identified 7 drivers for women's economic empowerment. We're focusing on a subset of those related to entrepreneurship, access to finance, and some of these things Elizabeth has also been working on. Access to digital resources, because in the modern economy, those two things go together. And they serve to help create opportunities for investment and for growing value. The pandemic, if anything, has really forced us to look at the access to digital. It's affected even the opportunities for girls to access education. And what we're pushing for here is to take a disruptive approach to who owns the digital resources, how they're allocated, and therefore how access is delivered. So our moonshot really is to put up a satellite that women and girls around the world could access in order to engage in education and in economic activity. Why can't it be done? And we've engaged with a couple of people in thinking about that, because I think that's the kind of disruptive thinking that we need to bring to the space, while making the point that this is not, again and again, it will not only benefit women and girls, everybody will benefit as a result. But what we need, if we're going to try to even come close to 2030, is to engage in some really disruptive thinking about how we craft solutions and how we create the impact or move in the direction in which we want to go. Another area that is often overlooked, but again, the pandemic has brought it into force, is the economic value of women's health. Insofar as women are disproportionately assigned or given access to resources to maintain their health and health care. We can think in terms of what that means economically for everybody and women's role in the economic sphere. And that's also linked to the care economy, believe it or not. So those two things go together. And most recently, we've started to look at entrepreneurship education and training and gender bias within the education and training. And so we're currently, with the support of the Government of Canada, leading a 4-country pilot in which we're working to adapt a scorecard or to test a scorecard that was developed by Professor Orser at Telfer Business School, Telfer School of Management, University of Ottawa. And Professor Orser is a board member of WAY. So we're very happy to be able to engage in this. But what we're coming to the point that was made earlier, when we think of an entrepreneur and you go back into the economic literature and Adam Smith, good guy that he was, when he conceived of this whole concept and how we engage, it's predominantly a male image. And we do not, in our current way of thinking, see the woman who sits on a street corner to sell food as an entrepreneur, but she is, because she has an asset, she has knowledge in how to turn that asset into a good that she can sell, and she takes on risk to produce the asset in order to generate a profit, however small it is. That's the essence of entrepreneurship. But in the last year, in a survey of university students at the University of Ottawa, when they were asked to identify entrepreneurs that they are aware of and they experience, women entrepreneurs, one of the ones they came up with was Beyonce. But for male entrepreneurs, of course, it's Steve Jobs and everybody else. So we're hoping, again, trying to be disruptive, to use this as a way to reframe the issues and hopefully help us to get move further in advancing the issues of gender economic equity.
That's wonderful. Margot, in our previous conversations, you hadn't ever mentioned the satellite, and I'm glad that you saved it for this panel. Talk about disruptions. Linda, I would like to turn to you now. We know that you've done research and you've authored publications, most recently this book, but I understand that now you're working on some new projects with USAID and maybe the World Bank. Tell us something about what you're working on today.
Yeah, sure. I've worked with international agencies and national governments and global charities throughout my career, but the thing I'm probably best known for is working with the multinationals. And I have really quite a lot of experience with this. But over the last couple of years, I've moved more into working with the international agencies, and I would say more the World Bank than anybody else. However, I want to mention the most recent thing, which is USAID, because I want people to help me with it. And this is a good example of what individuals can do, the kinds of things. And I in the book, I have a whole next steps epilogue with ideas that things people can do, but this is a really good one. I've just finished writing a piece for USAID that makes the argument that gender inequality is causal to poverty, that it causes poverty. And it involves a review of several of the things that we've talked about today, the barriers to employment, the barriers for entrepreneurs, but also barriers to education, but also things like health and the impact on conflict and hunger and trafficking. And so it's quite broad. And it basically is saying that instead of treating gender inequality as a symptom, we need to treat it as a structural cause. And this is why, for example, with the SDGs, there is so much, they would say, oh, but gender inequality is across all of these. Well, that's because gender inequality is across all of them, okay? It is a structural factor. It is always present, and it is always present everywhere. And it is pretty much the same everywhere. So this piece is going to go out not as Linda Scott author, but as an official USAID document tomorrow And either tomorrow or Monday, this is a piece that we're trying to push out because we're trying to convince economists and world leaders to rethink their attitudes toward the women's economy. And we are absolutely calling on everyone we know, me and USAID and Wade Chandler, who is the gender head at USAID, to push this out, whether they have access to traditional media, social media. If it's just your Facebook page, please put it on your Facebook page. And in order to know, I don't know the address off the top of my head what USAID would be, but my Twitter is at Prof. Linda Scott, and I absolutely will be tweeting the devil out of this over the next couple of days. So if you want to help pass it along, you can find it there at Prof. Linda Scott. This USAID thing is big, and if the most we can help it, it will have an impact. And I feel just privileged as hell to be involved in it.
That's fantastic, Linda. Thanks for sharing that. And we already follow you on Twitter, so I know that the center will we'll help you amplify that from the center. And I look forward to reading that report. So I'm cognizant of time, and I hope that we can get to some of the audience questions. A number have come in over the last hour, and we've received some at registration as well. But before we turn to questions from the audience, there is one more thing I'd like to ask you all. And where we've come from is we started talking about what exists, why it exists, and what we're doing right now to try to move the agenda forward. And my final question is, why? Why is this topic so important to you and to others within this ecosystem trying to do something about it? And why does closing the gender gap in the global economy matter?
Well, I'll go with that. This is something I work with a lot. There's really just truckloads of data at this point. This is just not sparse. This is not based on speculation. Women's economic participation has a positive causal effect on prosperity. It drives GDP in a major way. It is a major reason why the rich nations are rich, is because they set their women free earlier. It's a big deal. At the same time, there are costs associated with gender inequality, things like violence against women, that are massive. And in fact, people are working right now on quantifying that very thing. And the problem with it is the impact is so huge that it's hard to even collect all the dollars that we lose in the world economy because of it. It has an effect on some of the biggest human tragedies on this planet. It has an effect on conflict. As I said before, it affects human trafficking. It affects hunger. It affects all kinds of humanitarian issues. So whether we want to be benefiting and as was mentioned earlier, it affects things like the performance of corporations. So whether or not you want it to benefit your business pocketbook, or you want it to benefit your national economy, or you care about the humans' tragedy in the world, we have never had anything that had this much impact on the world's well-being. And it is worth every dime we've got, every minute we've got, and every bit of our souls to help it. So there you go. That's my soapbox.
If I could add to that, because I think Linda has captured it very well, but I also want to make the point that this is intergenerational. And if we don't arrest this now, we're actually, it's affecting those who follow us. And I think we have a responsibility. So when you think in terms of the sustainability issues as well, we need to look at it from that perspective. And what I like to say to audiences, and especially when you talk with ministers of finance, is insofar as we don't ensure or move to take advantage of or to help to grow our economic pie so that everybody can benefit by not fully including women in the economic space, we're actually imposing a tax, but not just on this generation, on the generations to come. And I think that should give the world pause, particularly at this juncture in time.
Margot, thank you for that. And I think that everyone on this panel would echo all of those words that Linda and Margot just gave us. And Linda, I do realize that you have a hard stop because you need to go at 1, but in the last 4 minutes here, maybe we can do some lightning round of questions from the audience. The first question is, and this is open to anyone, the WTO just announced its first woman director general. How significant is this for women and the WTO? Who wants to take that?
You're mute.
I'll take it just because I'm the one with the hard stop. It's hugely important. I think Christine Lagarde showed us just how much could be accomplished when we had women at the top of these international organizations. And the fact that we're about to have a critical mass of 3 or 4 of them, I think is huge. That's my view.
Great, thank you. Another question that has come in, how does the perception that women are already equal, in quotes, harm women in business? And how can it best be tackled at the local and global levels? And I'll add another spin to this because there's another related question, which is almost the opposite. How does the idea that women have to be better so they can't be ignored also harm women? So I think it's 2 ways to ask the same question.
So I'll maybe jump in just because I get so frustrated when we go into a, one of the most economically successful G7 economies, and we talk with women about getting certified as a woman-owned business so that they can make sure that buyers can find them more easily. And they say, well, I don't need that. I don't want to be selected because I'm a woman. And don't you know, we're equal here in this great country of ours. And the statistics do not bear that out. It is 1%, whether you're in Europe, Africa, Latin America, Asia, North America, women are invisible in global value chains, at least as suppliers. There is no country where women have equal access to earn those assets as business owners, and we've seen as employees. There is no country where it's equal. So I think there's the perception that boys and girls are being raised to think that everything's going to be equal, and then they get into the workforce and they're confused about why they're still making less, or if they're a business owner, why it's so hard for them. And then they think it's their fault, like they're doing something wrong, and they don't understand that the systems aren't set up for equal opportunity. And so I think part of it is empowering ourselves. If it's not working for half the population, we have purchasing power. We need to leverage that purchasing power and be conscious about how we all spend our money, how we reinvest our money, how we spend our time, how we give away our time for free all the time. All of these are questions where we have control or some influence, and we just need to decide that this isn't working for us, and we're going to work together to change it, because everyone will be better off when everyone has an equal opportunity to contribute and to benefit.
Great. Thank you so much for that perspective. I realize there's 1 minute left. I'll try to sneak in one last question here. How do we engage men, our colleagues, to encourage them to lead or co-lead change in this space?
Simona, how did you do it?
I can say something because, what is good for women is good for men as well. This is not about women antagonizing men, but it's about finding solutions for both men and women to cooperate and work in a better way. Shortly, I can tell you the 2 examples that I actually implemented as a leader. Part-time job has been considered in many countries, in Switzerland for sure, as a signal of non-commitment. And many women had to go for a part-time job if they wanted to continue working, because there's no particular help for childcare, unless it is super expensive. What I did is I opened to part-time for leadership positions, which was unheard of. And men were the first who tested it, because they had actually leadership positions at the time that women who had it didn't dare. And it worked very nicely for them, because they also want to devote more time to their families, to their hobbies, to their interests, and maybe supporting the female partner also to have compatible part-time and share the family responsibilities. And because men did it, also other women started to ask part-time and to be more engaged in career. And we have several leadership positions in part-time. And the other thing is paternity leave. In Switzerland, there were 2 days paternity leave, and we gave 2 months to support also their family and give a signal. And that was also very, very well perceived by men. So what's good for women is good also for men. I think we should start looking at people and how can we make them thrive in the organization, not fixing women, which is also another big mistake, but fixing processes that are wrongly organized.
Yes.
And structures and institutions and policies. This is my biggest takeaway from today. I could pepper you all with many more questions. We could spend hours talking about this, but I do, in the interest of time, have to conclude here. And I will say that this has been absolutely incredible. And I am, again, honored and incredibly humbled to have been able to spend just this hour with all of you today. So on behalf of the Center for Global Business and the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, College Park, thank you, Elizabeth, Margot, Linda, Simona, for sharing your time and your talent and expertise with us today. And I look forward to hosting you on campus if we can in the future, and to following up and maintaining contact.
Thank you very much.